The log weighed 470 pounds, rough-cut pine still weeping sap at both ends. Josiah Kern stood alone in a clearing 12 miles from the nearest human being, studying the massive timber lying at his feet. He had no team of men to help lift it, no horses or oxen to provide muscle, and no metal jacks or pulleys that Eastern builders took for granted. What he did have was a 10-foot lever carved from seasoned oak, 3 flat stones positioned with obsessive precision, and a dead brother whose frozen body he had buried 3 months earlier because their cabin's roof had collapsed under snow. Before we dive into how Josiah changed frontier construction forever, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. And if stories of impossible innovation move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode reveals an even more unbelievable frontier survival technique. The year was 1840. The Rocky Mountain fur trade was in its final profitable years, and men still came west, believing they could make their fortunes trapping beaver along the countless streams that fed the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers. Josiah Kern and his younger brother Thomas had arrived in the region 5 years earlier, 2 Ohio boys who had learned enough carpentry from their father to build serviceable structures but had never faced a genuine mountain winter. Their cabin stood in a valley where 3 creeks converged, chosen for its access to beaver ponds and its protection from prevailing winds. They had built it in late summer of 1840, using methods that had worked adequately in Ohio. Logs notched at corners, moss packed between gaps, a simple gabled roof supported by ridgepoles and covered with bark and pine branches. The structure had kept them dry through autumn and seemed solid enough as the first snows arrived in November. The winter of 1840 to 1841 came early and came hard. By mid-December, snow lay 4 feet deep in the valley. The brothers continued their trap lines when weather permitted, checking sets along the creeks, processing pelts in the cabin during storms. They had adequate supplies and enough firewood stacked against the exterior wall to last until spring. They believed they were prepared. On January 9, 1841, a storm moved through the valley that exceeded anything in Josiah's experience. Snow fell continuously for 36 hours. The temperature dropped to 20 degrees below zero. Wind shrieked through the trees surrounding their cabin, driving snow into every crack and gap in their construction. Inside, the brothers kept their fire burning and waited for the storm to pass. The roof began failing around midnight on the second night. The weight of accumulated snow, combined with the constant wind pressure, stressed the ridgepoles beyond their capacity. Josiah heard the wood groaning but didn't understand what the sound meant until too late. The western ridgepole snapped with a crack like a rifle shot. The roof sagged inward. Snow poured through the opening. Within seconds, the entire roof structure collapsed, burying both men under a combination of broken poles, bark, branches, and 3 feet of packed snow. Josiah managed to claw his way free. Thomas did not. By the time Josiah dug through to where his brother lay, Thomas was unconscious from cold and impact. He died an hour later despite everything Josiah tried. Josiah buried Thomas on a hillside above the valley 3 days after the storm ended. The ground was frozen, and digging the grave took him 8 hours with a shovel and iron bar. He marked it with stones arranged in a cross pattern and stood there for a long time, looking at the fresh earth and thinking about how completely he had failed to protect his only family. He returned to what remained of the cabin. The walls still stood, but the roof was a total loss. He salvaged what supplies he could and moved into a crude lean-to he constructed against the southern wall, using the remaining structure as a windbreak. For the next 2 months, he survived in this makeshift shelter, maintaining his trap lines because he needed the income from pelts, but spending every evening thinking about what had gone wrong. The answer was obvious. The cabin had been inadequate. Not just inadequate for mountain winters, but fundamentally flawed in its design and construction. Josiah began analyzing the failure with the methodical approach his father had taught him when teaching carpentry. The ridgepoles had been too thin for the span they supported. The roof pitch had been too shallow, allowing snow to accumulate rather than slide off. The notched corners had settled over time, creating gaps that weakened the entire structure. The foundation, or lack of one, had allowed moisture to rot the bottom logs, compromising structural integrity. But understanding why his cabin had failed didn't solve Josiah's larger problem. Spring would come, and he would need proper shelter before next winter. Building another cabin using the same methods would simply repeat the same failure. He needed something stronger, more carefully engineered, capable of withstanding the extreme conditions of a Rocky Mountain winter. The standard solution would be to find a partner or join a group of trappers for mutual protection and shared labor. Cabin raising on the frontier was traditionally a community event. 6 to 10 men working together could raise a cabin in 3 to 5 days. The work required multiple people lifting logs simultaneously, holding walls steady while corners were fitted, supporting ridgepoles while roof structures were assembled. It wasn't a task designed for solo execution. But Josiah had no partner now, and he had never been comfortable around groups of people. Even in Ohio, he had preferred working alone in his father's workshop to socializing in town. The mountain men he encountered during his 5 years in the region were generally rough company, heavy drinkers, and storytellers who regarded Josiah's quiet nature as unfriendly. He had no close friends in the trapping community and no desire to become dependent on men he barely knew. This left him with an impossible situation. He needed to build a cabin strong enough to survive anything the mountains could deliver. Standard construction methods required multiple people. He was alone and intended to stay that way. The mathematics seemed simple and insurmountable. One man could not raise a cabin alone. Except Josiah didn't accept that conclusion. He had spent 5 years in these mountains. He had learned that most things people called impossible were simply things no one had figured out how to do yet. Spring arrived in the valley in late March of 1841. The snow melted rapidly, and the 3 creeks swelled with runoff. Josiah watched the water rise to within feet of where his collapsed cabin stood and realized another flaw in his original construction. He had built too close to the water, prioritizing convenience over safety. A proper cabin needed elevation, both for flood protection and to keep the structure above ground moisture that caused rot. As the weather warmed and he resumed full-time trapping, Josiah found his mind returning constantly to memories of Ohio, specifically to the 3 years he had spent as an apprentice to Samuel Hartwick, a master carpenter in Columbus who built commercial structures and warehouses. Hartwick had been a demanding teacher, insisting that his apprentices understand not just how to cut and join wood, but why certain techniques worked and others failed. One lesson came back to Josiah with particular clarity. He had been 16 years old, watching Hartwick and a single assistant move a massive oak beam into position for a warehouse roof. The beam weighed at least 500 pounds, far too heavy for 2 men to lift directly, but Hartwick had used a system of ropes, pulleys, and leverage that allowed them to raise the beam precisely into place without additional help. Josiah remembered asking how it worked. Hartwick had explained the principle of mechanical advantage. A lever properly positioned could multiply human strength by factors of 10 or more. A pulley system could distribute weight across multiple points, making heavy loads manageable. The key was understanding ratios, fulcrum placement, and load distribution. With the right tools and technique, one man could move objects that seemed impossibly heavy. At the time, Josiah had filed this information away as interesting but not particularly relevant to his work, cutting joists and fitting floorboards. Now, standing in a mountain valley 12 miles from the nearest human being, those principles seemed like the answer to an impossible problem. He began experimenting with the concept using materials available in the wilderness. He cut a straight pine pole 8 feet long and as thick as his wrist. He found a large flat stone near the creek. He positioned the stone as a fulcrum and used the pole as a lever to lift progressively larger rocks. The results were immediate and impressive. With proper leverage, he could lift stones weighing 200 pounds or more, moving them with control and precision. The principle worked. The question was whether it could scale up to moving logs weighing 400 to 500 pounds each, and whether he could develop a technique reliable enough to construct an entire cabin using this method. Josiah spent the next 2 weeks testing different lever lengths, fulcrum positions, and lifting techniques. He used logs from his collapsed cabin as test subjects, experimenting with ways to position them, roll them, and lift them into place. He discovered that a 10-foot lever made from seasoned hardwood provided the best combination of strength and manageability. He learned that fulcrum height mattered enormously. Too low, and the mechanical advantage was minimal. Too high, and the lever became unstable. He also rediscovered something Hartwick had taught him about patience. Moving heavy objects safely required slow, controlled movements. Rushing led to accidents, lost leverage, and wasted energy. The technique demanded methodical precision, which suited Josiah's temperament perfectly. By late April, he had convinced himself it was possible. One man, working alone with nothing but levers, ropes, and carefully applied physics, could construct a cabin. Josiah began construction of his primary tool in early May of 1841. He needed a lever strong enough to withstand repeated stress, long enough to provide significant mechanical advantage, and light enough that he could reposition it throughout the construction process. After examining dozens of trees in the surrounding forest, he selected a white oak that had died standing several years earlier. The wood had seasoned naturally, making it both lighter and stronger than fresh-cut timber. He felled the tree using his axe and cut a 10-foot section from the straightest part of the trunk. The piece was roughly 6 inches in diameter, heavy enough to provide strength but manageable for one man to carry. Over the next week, he used his draw knife to shape the lever, removing bark and smoothing the surface. He tapered one end slightly to create a working point that could fit under logs more easily. The other end he left thicker to provide a comfortable grip and prevent splitting under pressure. The finished lever weighed approximately 40 pounds. Josiah tested it extensively, using it to lift logs from his destroyed cabin and move them to a clearing he had selected for his new structure. The lever performed exactly as he had calculated. With proper fulcrum placement, he could lift one end of a log weighing 350 pounds, raising it high enough to slide supports underneath, or reposition it as needed. But lifting one end of a log was different from constructing a cabin. He needed to develop techniques for moving logs horizontally, rotating them, stacking them, and holding them in position while he secured them. This required additional tools and methods. Josiah created a series of fulcrum stones, each carefully selected for size and shape. He found flat rocks at the creek that were approximately 8 to 12 inches tall and stable when positioned on level ground. These became his mobile fulcrums, allowing him to set up leverage points wherever needed during construction. He gathered 20 of these stones, more than he thought necessary, and arranged them near his building site. He also prepared rope. Trappers carried rope for various purposes, and Josiah had a limited supply of hemp rope purchased from trading posts. But he needed more than he could afford to buy, so he spent several days braiding rope from elk hide he had processed over the winter. The rawhide rope was strong and flexible when wet, though it would shrink and stiffen when dry. He learned to keep it damp during use and plan his work around its characteristics. With his tools prepared, Josiah attempted his first complete solo log lift. He selected a pine log he had cut for testing, a straight piece approximately 14 feet long and 10 inches in diameter. Based on his estimates, it weighed close to 400 pounds. This was the size log he would need for cabin walls, so if he couldn't manage this weight, his entire plan would fail. He positioned his fulcrum stone 2 feet from one end of the log. He slid his lever underneath the log, with the tapered end positioned just past the log's center point. He gripped the opposite end of the lever and applied downward pressure. The log rose smoothly. He lifted it approximately 18 inches off the ground, high enough to slide a support log underneath. He then repositioned his lever to the opposite end and repeated the process. Within 15 minutes, he had elevated both ends of the log onto support logs, raising it to a working height. The technique worked perfectly. Josiah stood back and looked at the elevated log, feeling something he hadn't experienced since Thomas died. Not quite hope, but a close relative. Possibility. The foundation consumed 3 weeks of Josiah's early summer. Most frontier cabins had no foundation at all, their bottom logs sitting directly on earth or on quickly arranged flat stones at the corners. Josiah had seen the results of this approach in abandoned cabins throughout the region. Bottom logs rotted within 5 years. Structures settled unevenly, creating gaps and structural weakness. Floors became damp and unusable. He intended to build something better. His solution was elevation. He would raise his entire cabin 2 feet above ground level on stone pillars. This would protect the logs from ground moisture, allow air circulation underneath the structure, provide drainage during heavy rains, and create a barrier against burrowing animals and insects. It would also, he realized, create a visual statement. A cabin sitting on stone pillars announced that its builder understood principles most frontier construction ignored. Josiah selected a building site on higher ground, 50 yards from the creek. The location was less convenient for hauling water, but it sat above the high water marks he had observed during spring runoff. The ground was relatively level, sloping only slightly toward the south. He cleared the site of vegetation and used stakes and rope to mark the cabin's perimeter. His structure would be 14 feet by 16 feet, slightly smaller than his previous cabin, but adequate for one person. He dug shallow holes at each corner and at 3 points along each long wall, creating 11 foundation positions. Each hole was approximately 1 foot deep, dug down to more solid subsoil. Into each hole he placed a large flat stone as a base. These base stones needed to be level relative to each other, which required careful measurement and adjustment. Josiah used a long straight pole and a simple water level he had constructed from a length of transparent elk intestine filled with water. The technique was crude but effective. He spent 2 full days adjusting base stones until all 11 were on the same plane. Building the pillars themselves required a different kind of precision. Josiah gathered flat stones from the creek beds, selecting each one for size, shape, and surface flatness. He needed stones that would stack stably without mortar or chinking, relying entirely on friction, weight distribution, and careful positioning. Each pillar required 15 to 20 stones, depending on their individual thickness. Josiah stacked them slowly, testing stability after each addition. He learned to select stones that had slight irregularities on their surfaces. Perfectly smooth stones could shift under load. Stones with minor texture locked together better. The corner pillars were most critical. These would bear the greatest structural loads, supporting the weight of walls and roof at points where stress concentrated. Josiah built these pillars with obsessive care, sometimes spending an entire day on a single pillar, removing and replacing stones multiple times until he achieved arrangements that felt absolutely stable. He tested each pillar by standing on top of it and shifting his weight in different directions. Any movement meant disassembling and rebuilding. Other trappers occasionally passed through the valley during this period. 2 stopped to observe what Josiah was doing. Both asked why he was wasting time stacking rocks. One suggested he had been alone too long. Josiah offered no explanations. By late June of 1841, Josiah's stone pillars stood complete, and the real construction could begin. He had spent the previous 2 weeks cutting logs, selecting trees with exceptional straightness and consistent diameter. Each log was approximately 14 feet long and 10 to 12 inches thick. He cut 24 logs total, enough for walls that would rise to 7 feet at their lowest point. The logs lay near his building site, stripped of bark and drying in the summer sun. The first log presented the fundamental challenge his entire technique needed to solve. He had to lift a 400-pound timber 2 feet off the ground and position it precisely across 2 stone pillars 16 feet apart. Standard construction would require at least 4 men to accomplish this. Josiah had his lever, his fulcrum stones, and his rope. He began by positioning his fulcrum stone approximately 3 feet from one end of the log. He slid his oak lever underneath, applied pressure, and lifted the end 18 inches into the air. He quickly slid a support log underneath to hold it at that height. He repeated this process at the opposite end. The log now rested on 2 temporary supports, elevated but not yet at the correct height or position. Next came the critical innovation. Josiah had prepared wooden skids, essentially smaller logs, that created inclined ramps from ground level to the top of his stone pillars. He positioned one skid, leading to each pillar that would support the log's ends. Using his lever and a combination of lifting and sliding motions, he worked the log slowly up both skids simultaneously. This required constant repositioning of his tools, moving from one end to the other, lifting a few inches, checking alignment, then repeating the process. The work was exhausting. Each adjustment required careful lever placement and controlled force. Rushing would cause the log to slip or roll. Josiah moved deliberately, taking breaks when his muscles began shaking from sustained effort. After 4 hours, he had the first log positioned correctly on its pillars, running parallel to the cabin's long axis. He secured it temporarily, using wooden pegs driven into the pillars, then stepped back to examine his work. The log sat level and stable, precisely where he needed it. The technique worked. It was slow and physically demanding, but it worked. Over the next 8 weeks, Josiah repeated this process for every log in his cabin walls. Some logs took 6 hours to position. Others, as he refined his technique and built supporting structures, took as little as 3 hours. He developed methods for stacking logs on top of each other, using his lever to lift one edge while sliding spacers underneath, then working around the perimeter until the new log rested properly on the one below. He cut notches at corners using his axe and draw knife, creating interlocking joints that added structural rigidity. Between each log, he packed a mixture of clay and dried grass, creating tight seals that would keep out wind and moisture. The walls rose slowly but steadily, each course adding weight and stability to the structure beneath. The walls reached their full height by mid-August. Josiah stood inside his partially completed structure and looked up at the open sky where a roof should be. This represented his most difficult challenge yet. Wall logs could be maneuvered into position one at a time, with the ground providing a stable work surface. Roof construction required lifting heavy ridge poles 8 feet into the air and holding them in place while securing them to the wall structure. He had no scaffolding, no assistant to hold one end while he secured the other, and no block and tackle system capable of handling the required weight. He spent 3 days studying the problem before attempting any physical work. The solution, when it came to him, was essentially a combination of ramp and temporary support system. He would build his way up to the roof, rather than trying to lift components directly into place. Josiah began by constructing an inclined ramp inside the cabin, running from floor level to the top of the eastern wall. The ramp was made from smaller logs laid across support posts, creating a gradual slope approximately 30 degrees from horizontal. This ramp allowed him to drag or roll heavy ridge poles up to wall height, using rope and steady pulling, rather than trying to lift them vertically. Once a ridge pole reached the top of the ramp, he faced the next challenge, positioning it to span across the cabin width. He built a temporary platform at the top of the eastern wall, essentially a wooden shelf that extended inward from the wall top. This platform was secured to the wall logs using rope lashings and supported from below by diagonal braces. The platform gave him a stable work surface at height. With the platform in place, Josiah could move a ridge pole up the ramp, slide it onto the platform, then use his lever with a fulcrum positioned on the platform itself to lift one end of the ridge pole higher. He would prop that end on a temporary vertical post, then move to the opposite end and repeat the process. Through successive lifting and supporting actions, he gradually walked the ridge pole into its final position, spanning the cabin width. The entire sequence for positioning one ridge pole took most of a day. He needed 6 ridge poles spaced evenly across the cabin's length. Each one required the same careful process. By early September, all 6 were in place, creating the skeleton of his roof structure. The remaining roof work was simpler but still time-consuming. He cut and positioned smaller cross members that ran perpendicular to the ridge poles, creating a framework. Over this, he laid split planks that he had prepared during evening hours throughout the summer. The planks overlapped like shingles, each layer covering the gaps in the layer below. Over the planks, he placed birch bark for waterproofing, then a final layer of sod that would root and create a living roof. The multiple layers made the roof extraordinarily heavy, but his stone foundation and solid wall construction supported the weight without any sign of stress or settling. Josiah completed his cabin in late September of 1841. The structure stood solid and complete, elevated on its stone pillars, with walls that showed no gaps and a roof that promised to shed snow rather than collect it. He moved his supplies inside, built a simple sleeping platform, and prepared for the coming winter with a confidence he had not felt the previous year. When the first snows arrived in November, his cabin remained warm and dry. The roof held, the walls stood firm. He had succeeded. Winter passed without incident. Spring of 1842 brought melting snow and swollen creeks, and the elevated foundation kept his cabin above the flooding that affected lower ground. Josiah resumed trapping, working his lines and processing pelts, living the solitary existence he preferred. He had no intention of seeking out other people or explaining what he had built. The cabin served its purpose. That was sufficient. But in early May, other people found him. A wagon train traveling the Oregon Trail had taken a northern route that brought them within a few miles of Josiah's valley. One of the travelers, a woman named Rebecca Whitmore, had heard trappers at Fort Union mention a raised cabin built by a man working alone. The description had intrigued her. She convinced two men from the wagon train to accompany her on a brief detour to see if the story was true. They arrived at Josiah's clearing on a bright morning while he was outside splitting firewood. Rebecca introduced herself and explained that they meant no intrusion but had heard remarkable stories about his cabin. Josiah, uncomfortable with visitors but too polite to refuse, allowed them to examine the structure. Rebecca walked around the cabin slowly, studying the stone pillars, the careful log fitting, the solid roof construction. She asked how many men had helped him build it. Josiah told her he had built it alone. She asked how long it had taken. He estimated 3 months of focused work. She asked if she could see his tools. He showed her his oak lever, his collection of fulcrum stones, and his coils of rope. One of the men accompanying Rebecca, a carpenter from Pennsylvania, asked Josiah to demonstrate his technique. Josiah obliged, using his lever to lift a heavy log he had cut for firewood repairs. He explained fulcrum positioning, mechanical advantage ratios, and load distribution principles while performing the demonstration. The carpenter watched in silence, then shook his head slowly and said he would not have believed it possible if he had not seen it with his own eyes. Rebecca asked if other trappers knew about his building method. Josiah said a few had seen the cabin, but most had shown little interest. She told him that people moving west needed to know this technique existed. Families traveling to Oregon or California often arrived at their destinations late in the season with little time to build shelter before winter. Being able to construct adequate housing with minimal manpower could save lives. Josiah had not considered his cabin in those terms. He had simply solved a personal problem. Rebecca Whitmore returned to her wagon train and shared what she had seen. The story spread through the traveling party that evening around campfires. A man building alone, using nothing but wooden levers and stone fulcrums, had raised a cabin that looked professionally constructed. Some dismissed the story as exaggeration. Others wanted to learn more. By the time the wagon train reached Fort Union 3 days later, multiple people were asking traders and trappers about the raised cabin and the man who built it. Marcus Webb operated the largest trading post at Fort Union. He dealt in furs, supplies, information, and gossip. When travelers began asking about Josiah Kern's construction technique, Webb recognized a story worth documenting. He made the journey to Josiah's valley in June of 1842, bringing paper and pencil to sketch the cabin and record details of the building method. Josiah tolerated Webb's visit with the same patient discomfort he showed all visitors. He answered questions about lever length, fulcrum positioning, log weights, and construction sequence. Webb took notes and made rough drawings of the stone pillars, the lever system, and the overall structure. He asked if Josiah would be willing to teach the technique to others. Josiah said he had no objection to people learning whatever they found useful. Webb returned to Fort Union and began mentioning the technique to trappers and settlers who passed through. He showed his sketches. He explained the basic principles as he understood them. He told people that Josiah Kern had proven one man could build substantial shelter alone if he applied intelligence to the problem. Some listeners remained skeptical, but others were intrigued enough to visit Josiah's valley themselves. Among the visitors was Henry Dorset, a trapper who had operated in the region for 12 years. Dorset had been one of the men who mocked Josiah's stone pillar construction the previous summer. He arrived at the valley in late June with a different attitude. He told Josiah he needed to build a new cabin before winter and had no partner to help with the work. He asked if Josiah would teach him the lever technique. Josiah spent 3 days working with Dorset, demonstrating fulcrum positioning, explaining mechanical advantage calculations, and helping him practice lifting increasingly heavy logs. Dorset was a strong man with good practical sense. He understood the principles quickly. By the end of the 3rd day, he was operating the lever system competently. He thanked Josiah, purchased rope and other supplies from Webb's trading post, and began construction on his own raised cabin 10 miles south of Josiah's location. Through the summer and fall of 1842, 2 more trappers visited Josiah seeking instruction. He helped both men understand the technique. By winter, 3 new cabins stood in the northern Rockies, all elevated on stone foundations, all built by single men working alone. The method was spreading not through any organized teaching effort, but through practical demonstration and word of mouth among people who needed exactly what Josiah had created. A way to build adequate shelter without depending on others. The years following 1842 saw Josiah Kern's building technique become standard knowledge among isolated trappers, prospectors, and homesteaders throughout the northern Rocky Mountain region. The method was never formally documented in engineering texts or construction manuals. It spread through demonstration, observation, and practical necessity. Men who needed to build alone learned the lever technique because it worked, and because the alternative was risking inadequate shelter. By 1845, trappers throughout Montana and Wyoming territories referred to elevated cabins as Kern structures, though many builders who used the technique had never met Josiah personally. The name stuck because it provided convenient shorthand for a specific approach to frontier construction. When someone mentioned they were building a Kern cabin, others understood immediately what that meant. Stone foundation, careful log selection, lever-based solo construction, and structural integrity that exceeded standard frontier building. Government surveyors mapping the region in 1846 documented Josiah's original cabin in their field notes. One surveyor, Samuel Bridger, included a detailed description and sketch in his journal, noting that the structure represented remarkable engineering achievement for frontier conditions. Bridger estimated the cabin would remain structurally sound for 30 to 40 years with minimal maintenance, far exceeding the typical lifespan of mountain cabins. Josiah himself continued living in his valley through the 1840s and 50s. He maintained his trap lines even as the fur trade collapsed and other mountain men left for California goldfields or Oregon settlements. He preferred isolation to civilization and saw no reason to change a life that suited him. Visitors still came occasionally, some seeking to learn his building technique, others simply curious about the man behind the stories. Josiah treated all visitors with the same quiet courtesy and minimal conversation. In 1853, a severe winter storm tested Kern structures throughout the region. Heavy snow loads and extreme cold destroyed many standard cabins. Trappers and settlers who had built using Josiah's technique reported no structural failures. The elevated foundations prevented moisture damage. The carefully fitted logs shed wind without creating gaps. The multi-layer roofs held under snow weight that collapsed simpler construction. The storm provided inadvertent proof that Josiah's obsessive attention to structural principles had been justified. Josiah Kern died in 1867 at the age of 60. He was found in his cabin by a passing trapper, apparently having died peacefully in his sleep. He was buried on the hillside next to his brother Thomas, the tragedy that had started everything. His cabin stood empty for several years before a homesteading family discovered it and moved in, grateful for shelter that required no construction effort. The building stood until 1893, when it was finally dismantled by a rancher who needed the logs for other purposes. By that time, it had served as shelter for 52 years, protecting multiple families and proving that knowledge applied carefully could create something lasting. Throughout the Mountain West, Other cabins built using Josiah's technique continued standing, silent monuments to one man's refusal to accept that impossible meant impossible. His innovation had been born from loss, refined through obsession, and shared freely, because good ideas that solve real problems deserve to spread. The frontier had been conquered not just by toughness or weapons, but by intelligence applied to fundamental challenges. Josiah Kern had proven that sometimes the most revolutionary act was simply figuring out how to build something that would not fail.